el anuncio y el mensaje de protección civil.
Muy buenos días, bienvenidas, bienvenidos a esta aula magna de su casa abierta al tiempo. Tenemos un breve pero importante mensaje de protección civil, sobre todo para los externos que nos visitan hoy. En la UAM Coajimalpa existen dos tipos de alarma, una alarma contra sismos y una alarma contra incendios. Estamos en un edificio seguro. En caso de sonar cualquier alarma, por favor, mantengan la calma. Los brigadistas estamos identificados por un gafete o un chaleco naranja y les estaremos dando las instrucciones. Es importante que si suena una alarma, por favor, identifiquen las salidas de emergencia que en este espacio se encuentran en las esquinas de esta aula magna. Y por favor, si es alerta sísmica, identifiquen dónde vamos a replegarnos hasta que pase el temblor. Posteriormente, vamos a bajar por las escaleras de emergencia para llegar hasta el frente del edificio en las canchas deportivas. Ese es el punto de reunión donde todos vamos a estar allí para ser censados y para recibir las instrucciones de nuestras autoridades. Les recordamos no usar elevadores y que las rampas que se encuentran al frente del edificio son para personas con discapacidad. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias. Y ahora sí, les damos la más cordial bienvenida a todos y a todos ustedes a la Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana. La División de Ciencias Sociales y Humanidades de la Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana, Unidad Coajimalpa, les da la más cordial bienvenida y agradece su presencia a la segunda conferencia magistral del taller de investigación, un análisis económico con perspectiva de género. Nos acompañan en la modalidad remota el doctor Óscar Lozano Carrillo, rector de la Unidad Azcapotzalco, así como el doctor Abelardo Mariña, coordinador de enlace estratégico de la misma unidad y miembro del área de investigación, sociedad y acumulación capitalista. De manera presencial, nos acompañan la doctora Aureola Quiñones Salcido, del Cuerpo Académico Derecho, Administración e Instituciones. La doctora Marcia Leite, titular de la Cátedra Frederick Engels. Y a nuestra invitada, la doctora İpek İlkarayan, de la Universidad Tecnológica de Estambul, Turquía. Agradecemos a todos los participantes que desde Argentina, Brasil, Cuba, así como de diferentes estados de la República que se han conectado en la modalidad remota y están presentes digitalmente. Sean a todos y a todas ellas bienvenidos y bienvenidas. Antes de iniciar, le pedimos, por favor, a la doctora Marcia Leite nos dé unas palabras. Por favor, doctora.
Buenos días a todos y todas. Me gustaría, antes que nada, agradecer más una vez a İpek İlkarayan por haber aceptado nuestra invitación para dictar este taller, estar aquí con nosotros en este taller. Me gustaría también saludar al rector de la Universidad Autónoma Mexicana, Unidad Azcapotzalco, que nos sigue en línea, y mis colegas, la secretaria académica de la División de Ciencias Sociales y Humanidad, Esther Morales, y Aureola Quiñones, que está aquí a mi lado. Muchas gracias a todos, sean todos y todas muy bienvenidos.
Ahora es momento de escuchar a nuestra invitada que nos presentará la conferencia El impacto de las inversiones en actividades de cuidado en la economía. Un análisis de la gravedad con la que emergió la carencia de trabajo de cuidado durante la pandemia y la necesidad de pensar en políticas públicas para mitigar los efectos de las crisis ambientales y de salud. A continuación, me permitiré leer una pequeña semblanza de nuestra conferencista. La doctora İpek es profesora de economía en la Universidad Técnica de Estambul, İTÜ, Turquía. Además, es presidenta electa de la Asociación Internacional de Economía Feminista, IAFE, para 2022-2023. Ella recibió su doctorado, PhD, en la Universidad de New School for Social Research de Nueva York. La doctora İpek también es investigadora asociada de Levy Economics Institute de Nueva York y del Foro de Investigación Económica ERF de El Cairo, además de ser editora asociada de la revista académica Feminist Economics. En 2018 al 2020 estuvo en la Universidad de Roma Sapienza en Italia con una beca de profesora visitante. Ilkarayan se ha desempeñado como miembro de la Junta IAFE y de la Asociación de Economía del Medio Oriente, MEA. También es miembro fundador de Mujeres por los Derechos Humanos de las Mujeres, Nuevas Formas, Plataforma de Trabajo y Empleo de las Mujeres, Centros de Estudios de la Mujer de la ITU y Red GEM Europa de Género y Macroeconomía. Las áreas de investigación de la doctora İpek incluyen la economía del cuidado, el género y la macroeconomía, la economía política del género, los mercados laborales y el desarrollo. Su modelo de economía púrpura, que representa una economía sustentable, solidaria y con igualdad de género, fue adoptado por varias organizaciones de mujeres con una herramienta de lobby, incluido el Lobby Europeo de Mujeres en Bruselas y el International Women's Rights Action Watch, por sus siglas en inglés IWRAW, Asia-Pacífico en Malasia. Actualmente es profesora de la Universidad Tecnológica de Estambul, Turquía, y presidenta electa de la International Association for Feminist Economics, IAFE, durante los años 2022 y 2023. La doctora nos presentará la discusión sobre nuevos modelos económicos basados en la preocupación con los cuidados, con la vida de todos, o sea, con el buen vivir de toda la sociedad, con su conferencia magistral, La Economía Púrpura. Así que, sin más preámbulos, estaré dándole la palabra a la doctora İpek İlkarayan. Estamos por atender brevemente ahorita. En breve ya están poniendo la presentación. Esta presentación para que todos ustedes puedan observarla y tenerla. Y voy a tratar de hacer rápidamente un pequeño resumen sobre esta parte de la segunda conferencia. Esta va a tratar sobre el análisis de la gravedad con la que emergió la carencia de trabajo de cuidado durante la pandemia y la necesidad de pensar en políticas públicas para mitigar los efectos de las crisis ambientales y de salud. El título de esta conferencia es El impacto de las inversiones en las actividades de cuidado en la economía. Como les mencionaba, es un tema fundamental para la doctora, puesto que ella nos presentará una discusión sobre nuevos modelos económicos basados en la preocupación con los cuidados, con la vida de todos, o sea, con el buen vivir de toda la sociedad, con su conferencia magistral La Economía Púrpura. Ahora sí, le doy la palabra a la doctora. Doctora, adelante. Go on.
Gracias. Buenos días. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are, because I know we have people connected online. There's a little problem about getting the PowerPoint presentation on the screen. So while the technicians are working on getting that reflected, I may as well start a little bit with a description or a context as to what I will be presenting today. So as it has already been said in the introduction, and thank you for the detailed and comprehensive introduction into my work and background. I have been working as an economist, as a professor of economics at Istanbul Technical University, doing research on macroeconomics, care economy, political economy of gender, and labor economics. And the care economy, is this okay now?
Yes.
Is it on? And can you put it on full screen, please?
Full screen, okay.
And as the pandemic arrived, I had been already working on a series of research projects in the context of different countries on the care economy, looking at the impact of investing in the care economy, particularly expansion of care services for childcare, elderly care, disabled care, how such investments, public investments, impact the economy.
Yes.
This is,
Full screen.
is that full screen? I don't see full screen. I can see the, yeah, now it's full screen. And how do I move forward? Okay, great, thank you. And when the pandemic arrived, and we went into a lockdown around the globe, of course, one of the first questions that arose for people like me, for researchers like me, who've been dealing with time use data all along. Time use data is data that shows how people in a country, in an economy, spend 24 hours in a day. And it's data that's collected through time use surveys by national statistics institutes. So most countries, including Mexico, have it. And so one of the things, one of the first questions that arose is how is that pandemic going to affect the time use patterns in a gendered manner of women and men, particularly with respect to what's going to happen to their unpaid work time, caring work time, and paid work time. So this is pretty much the context of the research that I will be presenting, because we conducted one of the first time use surveys under pandemic lockdown conditions in Turkey, along with a simultaneous survey in UK and Spain. So Turkey was one of the first 3 countries to hold a time use survey under pandemic conditions. Then a number of other countries followed. So this is the research that I'm going to be presenting to you. So our research questions were basically up at the start, what are the magnitudes of the changes induced by the COVID-19 lockdown in gender gaps in paid, unpaid, and total work time? Now, there's an emphasis on magnitudes because, in fact, there were a higher number of research studies conducted in different countries. Some of them were comparative in multiple countries, conducted by UN Women, for instance, asking people just the simple question of, are you spending more time on unpaid work? Yes or no? And then, are you spending more or less time on paid work? And then they presented the results as saying, for instance, 75% of the women replied to the question saying, yes, after the pandemic started, I am spending more time on unpaid work. But what we wanted to find in our survey was not only the percentage of women who said who were spending more time or less time, or the percentage of men, but really we wanted to measure the change in minutes. Like how many minutes was the change, the increase in unpaid work, how many minutes was the change in paid work, and so on. So this was our first question. And then we also wanted to look at how do these changes in paid work time, unpaid work time, and total work time of women and men depended on the changes in their labor market status, transitioning from employment into unemployment, or from working at the office, in the office or factory workplace, to working from home remotely, and also how it depended on their demographic and household characteristics. So, as I said, this was one of the first field surveys, time use surveys on gender and time use conducted under lockdown conditions. And it was conducted in May 2020 when the pandemic and the lockdown measures were at their peak, so to speak. This is the early stages. And the results have already been published as an academic article in a special issue of Feminist Economics on gender and the pandemic, and also as a policy note by UNDP Turkey, so they're accessible. Then a year passed by, and we wanted to also ask the follow-up questions as to how persistent were the changes that we identified under lockdown in the late pandemic era, post-lockdown, because we had a number of findings about the number of hours of increase in women's unpaid work time, the number of minutes, hours of increase in men's unpaid work time, and so on. And then a year had passed, after more than a year had passed after the lockdown, and we wanted to see whether those changes were still in place, or had they gone back to normal, to the pre-pandemic levels. And also this time we wanted to look at the impact of these new forms of employment, such as hybrid working, going into the office a number of days, staying at home, working from home remotely a number of days, hybrid work, remote work, teleworking. What was the impact of this on gender gaps in paid and unpaid work time? So to answer these questions, we worked with the same survey company to do a follow-up survey, this time in October 2021. And the results have been published as a research, as a survey report, more policy-oriented, and also it is in the form of a working paper. And in the meantime, I also undertook an encyclopedic entry with my colleague Marcella Corsi on bringing together the results of all this research on gendered trends under gendered economic trends under the COVID-19 pandemic, on COVID-19, gender and labor. And the Turkish surveys, the academic papers are co-authored with my colleague Emel Memiş, who's from Ankara University in Turkey. Okay, so first of all, let me place this whole issue in the literature, in the prior literature. The issue of gender changes in time use under shocks is actually something that has been already written about and analyzed in the context of different types of shocks and different countries. So one of these shocks is health shocks, such as, I think it started recording, yeah. Such as, for instance, the HIV, the Ebola or the Zika virus pandemics that were not global, more regionally contained, but nevertheless quite devastating pandemics in the regions and countries where they occurred. So there's work emerging from that has been done on Sub-Saharan Africa and South America on these more regionally contained pandemics. And this research basically shows a homogeneous impact of new demand on women's unpaid work time for healthcare, and how under such health shocks, women withdraw time from paid work and substitute time into unpaid work. Okay, and in some cases, this kind of substitution can be quite substantial. And there's another study on 38 low and middle income countries, which also shows that under health shocks, one of the additional gender impact that we find is a widening gender education gap for adolescent girls and boys, because girls are enforced to substitute their unpaid work time for education time. Okay, so these are some sort of glimpses into prior research on the impact of health shocks on gender trends, gender changes in unpaid and paid work time, and also education time. There is a huge range of I shouldn't say huge, but a much wider range of studies looking at the impact of economic shocks, economic crisis on time use, and there are different types of findings because the impact really depends on the directions of the substitution effects and the relative magnitudes of substitution effects of men's work time for being substituted for women's work time, and also unpaid work time being substituted for paid work time, or vice versa. Okay, so for instance, studies for the US financial crisis, the recent recession in 2008-2009, find that their mothers of young children substituted paid work time for unpaid work time due to some sort of added worker effect as male unemployment increased under that recession. So as male paid work time decreased, in order to compensate for loss of income, women had to increase their paid work time and decrease a little bit their unpaid work time, which then men substituted by through increasing their unpaid work time as their female partners went out and started working more at jobs. But research also finds out that this effect was not persistent in the post-crisis, that things started going back to where they were prior to the financial crisis. So for limitations of time, I'm not going to go over the various findings of this research. As you can see, there's one for Indonesian Asian crisis, for the Philippines 2008-2009 crisis, which has a very different finding, where actually both men and women started substituting unpaid work time as unpaid family workers in agriculture for paid work time, for instance, due to a general macroeconomic environment of joblessness. And also we have a similar research for Turkey under the global economic crisis, where we again find a very strong female added worker effect. So coming to COVID-19, for the first time, we had a shock that was both a health shock and an economic shock. So it was an interesting case. And not only that, but different from the previous health shocks that were regionally contained, we also had, maybe for the first time at a global scale, a lockdown environment, stay-at-home measures environment, which meant that there was a discontinuation of services for all families, all households, independent of their income, independent of their purchasing power. So whether you were a high income or a low income household, you couldn't access services in terms of going out to eat, or having domestic workers come to your house to do the work for you, or sending your children to a childcare center or to school, and so on. So there was a complete discontinuation, disruption of services, most of them care services, direct care or indirect care services, in addition to an economic crisis starting to take place. So most of the people who were informally employed and couldn't benefit from the government measures to protect employment for that reason, for instance, transitioned from being employed at the workplace to being unemployed at home, or from being, if you were in formal employment, from being employed in the workplace to being employed remotely in the within the household, and in many cases by reducing the employment hours. So it was a very interesting and different type of combinations of shocks. So as I've already said upfront, there were global assessments by international agencies such as UN Women, ILO, UNDP, UNICEF, looking at how this impacted the time allocation and how this impacted families altogether. But they also, some of these surveys included time use questions. But as I've said at the beginning, by simply asking, are you spending more time or less time on this kind of activity, on childcare? Are you spending more time or less time on, let's say, cooking and household work and so on, but without measuring the changes in time? So then there came, again, to repeat, a number of country-level time use surveys under lockdown. The UK, Spain, India, Turkey, and Italy were amongst the first set of countries. And what the common findings of these surveys is that they find a substantial decline in both men's and women's paid work. But in some cases, such as Turkey, which we will see shortly, the decrease in women's paid work time is less than the decrease in men's paid work time. And part of the explanation for that is because most of the women who continued in employment despite the lockdown were women who were employed in as essential workers in areas, in sectors that did never shut down, such as healthcare services, right? Or education services. Although schools closed down, services continued online, right? And for many people employed in the education sector, and in many countries this is predominantly women, the adoption process from in-class teaching to online teaching required a lot of additional hours of work for teachers, for education staff to get adjusted to for the first time to be teaching on time. So because these sectors, healthcare, education, also, for instance, retail in food, food markets, food sales, because these are mostly female-dominated sectors, we see that the paid work time for women decreased less. In some instances, for employed women, we in the Turkish context, we also found that the work time, the paid work time, increased under pandemic lockdown conditions. So then another common finding is a substantial increase in both men's and women's unpaid work time, a noteworthy increase in relative terms in men's care work time, unpaid care work time under the pandemic lockdown. Yet in all of these countries, in most of these countries, we still find that women shoulder a relatively higher share of a relatively higher share of the increase in demand for care work time. But how much more changes from one country to another? So Turkish context and India had relatively higher triggered relatively higher increases in gender gaps, gender inequalities in unpaid work time under pandemic lockdown. Well, like the one of the studies from Spain and one of the studies from the UK show that increase in demand for unpaid work was shared more or less equally between men and women, but the gender gap in unpaid work time remained because prior to the pandemic, women were already doing more. So it's interesting, and I think the next direction in research probably should be looking at what kind of institutional or policy or cultural factors, for instance, or measures in response to the pandemic led to different sort of levels of gender inequalities in these different country contexts under the pandemic. So there is also now a few emerging research studies following up with new field surveys in the late pandemic era, where we still have the pandemic, but we don't have the lockdown measures anymore. Whether the impact that was identified under lockdown is persisting, to what level is it persisting? And the emerging evidence, for example, from Italy, is showing that the trends in paid and unpaid work time for men and women are going back to what they were in the pre-pandemic, particularly with men who had increased their unpaid work time under lockdown, now decreasing it back to pre-pandemic levels, more or less. But again, it changes from one country to another, and we will today focus on the case of Turkey. I keep saying Turkey, but now, there's a change, official change. The name of the country, in fact, is Turkey. So I should get adjusted to saying that in English as well. So Turkey has first of all, has the second widest gender gap in unpaid work time amongst OECD countries after Japan. And as a mirror reflection of that, it has one of the highest gender gaps in employment. It has one of the lowest female employment rates, at around only 32% for the prime working age group 15 to 64, versus an OECD average of 61%. And versus a male employment rate in Turkey for this prime working age group of 68%. At the same time, beyond the gender gaps, we observe wide disparities amongst women themselves by socioeconomic status, by education level, and by employment status, such that university-educated women's employment rate is more than double the employment rate of women with less than high school education. And there's the difference in unpaid work time between highly educated and lower educated women are not so much as in the case of employment rate. There's a difference of unpaid work time of higher educated and lower educated women by a little bit more than an hour a day. The average time in employment for women is 19 years versus 39 years for men. So that goes to show, beyond the gender gaps in employment, actually women who enter employment stay in employment a shorter time period, half the time period work experience of men. And the gender wage gap is around 14 to 28%. And the unpaid work time and the paid work time, which you can see on the slide here, is over 4 hours for women for unpaid work on a daily basis, and slightly less than an hour at 51 minutes for men. So there's a gap. And the paid work time, this is including all employed and non-employed women for the overall population, is about 1 hour, 10 minutes for women, and almost 4 hours on a daily basis for men. And so in that context, there has been ongoing policy debates in the Turkish policy circles since the 2000s of the need for work-life balance policies and access to care services as an essential intervention to empower women in the labor market. So under COVID-19, there were widespread lockdown measures in the first half of 2020 and then gradually relaxed through 21. And there was a strong employment protection policy and short-time work measures that lasted through 2021. Despite this, when we compare national statistics from 2019 to 2020, we see that close to 1 million women withdrew from the labor force in that year, from pre-pandemic to the pandemic, versus about 400,000 men. And there was a 2.5 percentage point decline in women's employment rate versus a 3.1 percentage point decline in the male employment rate. And when we look at 21 national statistics, we see that the male employment rate recovers, similar to 2019, back to over 68%, whereas female employment rate is by 2021 remains about half a percentage point lower than what it was in the pre-pandemic era. Okay, so let's come to the field research. We use data coming from 3 field surveys. The first field survey was conducted in April 2018. Okay, so this is a field survey that we weren't involved in, first of all. It was conducted by a well-known and well-respected research company called Conda. It's a private research company, but they act almost as a nonprofit, I would say. And they are known for their political opinion polls. And they conduct a survey called the Lifestyle Survey on a monthly basis every year since 2010. And this lifestyle survey asks a series of standard questions to a nationally representative survey of adult people about their political preferences, voting behavior, lifestyles. And each monthly survey entails a set of 5 to 10 questions on topical issues of that month. For instance, about the pandemic, or if there was a particular about the World Cup in Qatar or whatever. So in the April 2018 survey, Conda had already included as an additional question a time use question where they asked people, here is a chart of 24 hours divided into 10-minute intervals. Please, could you tell us how you spent a typical day in the previous week? Take a typical day in the previous week and tell us how you spent the 24 hours. So this was not your regular time use question, but it was close. And we took advantage of that one question that they had asked in 2018, and we approached them under lockdown saying, would you repeat for us, if we made a collaboration with you as a gender economics research team, would you repeat for us the same question under the lockdown survey? They agreed. So the exact same time use question was inserted into the May 2020 survey. And you may ask, how did they conduct the research under lockdown? They didn't do it by phone. It was a partial lockdown during the week, complete lockdown on weekends in the Turkish context. So the surveyors went actually to the doors of people, knocked on doors, and stood outside and conducted the survey in that manner. And then the follow-up survey was in October 2021, and there we had the support of the Heinrich Böll Stiftung, which is a foundation under the German Greens, and they have country offices in different countries. Turkey is one of them, and they gave funding to Conda in order to conduct this time, use the same time use question and conduct a comprehensive survey on care and time use in the late pandemic. Okay, so let's come to some of the preliminary results. So we repeated a similar question to all these surveys as in, conducted by UNDP, UN Women, ILO, and so on. So we said, with the pandemic, did the time you devote to housework change, and in what way? So 67% of the women interviewed in the lockdown survey, May 2020, said that the unpaid work time that they perform has increased. For men, this was 41%. When we go to the lower part, maybe I can move the cursor, the lower part of the slide, this is the October 21 late pandemic survey. So the time increase for women has gone down to 53%, and for men, it has decrease also to 35%. So with the lockdown measures being lifted and schools reopening and going back to partial normalization, those who are saying that I am now spending more time on unpaid work as compared to the pre-pandemic is 53% for women and 35% for men. So there seems to be some persistent impact there. So for married couples, we also asked them, what do you think about the unpaid work time of your spouse, of your husband, of your wife? So for women who are married, 37% of the married women said, my husband's work time has increased. And remember, this is the May 2020, for men, for themselves, they had said 41%. So it's pretty close, good perceptions. Couples agree with one another. And asking men, how about your wives? Do you think your wife's unpaid work time has increased? 63% said, yes, my wife's unpaid work time increased. And when we asked women themselves, it was 67%. So also pretty close, but there's generally an underreporting of spouses' work time. So these are similar figures for October 21. Women, but the difference is more. So in the late pandemic survey, when we went to married women and said, do you think your husband is spending more time on unpaid work than what he used to in the pre-pandemic era? 23% said, yes, he is. But when we asked men themselves, more than one third, 35% of the men said, I am spending more time. For women's perception, it's lower. And when we ask married men, how about your wife? Is your wife spending in this late pandemic more time on unpaid work as compared to the pre-pandemic? 47% said, yes, she is spending more time. For when we asked women themselves, it was 53%. So there's a little bit of a discrepancy now about what married women themselves think about whether their husband is spending more time and what men themselves think if they are spending more time. And here you have the raw results about the various activities of time use, comparing the pre-pandemic 2018, lockdown under pandemic 2020, and lockdown lifted late pandemic October 21. So paid work time for women, and it may seem these are average hours per day, and this paid work time may seem very low to you, but please remember two things, that this is an average including all women, whether they are employed or housewives or non-employed, retired or students, okay? So these are overall averages over all kinds of women, adult women. And also remember that Turkish female employment rate is very low, okay? So as a result, we have the low averages, but in any case, we can see the changes. The paid work time decreased from pre-pandemic of 1.6 hours per day to 1 hour per day under lockdown, and increased back to a little bit over the pre-pandemic levels of 1.8 hours per day. The unpaid work time increased from 2.8 pre-pandemic, more than 1.5 times, to 4.2 under the pandemic hours per day. So it's 1.5 hour decrease per day, and decreased to 3.3 in the late pandemic. So there is a decrease, but still above what it used to be in the pre-pandemic. This is a similar figure for men, where you see the reverse opposite, where paid work time is more and unpaid work time is less. So for men, paid work time decreased from its pre-pandemic level of 5.1 hours per day to 3.3 under lockdown, and increased back to 5.3 in the late pandemic. And men's unpaid work time increased from 0.3 hours per day pre-pandemic to 0.8 under lockdown and back to 0.4 in the late pandemic. Now, note something, these are averages, okay? So I will shortly show you how when we adjust those raw averages for demographic changes across the different samples of the 3 field surveys, the results will change a little bit. And these are looking at what's happening to the gender gaps, not to the R's, but the gender gaps. The gender gap, and this is looking at for all people versus employed women and men. So the gender gap in, let's see, unpaid work time increased from 1.3 to 1.7 and back to the pre-pandemic level, whereas for employed women and men, it increased from almost 2.6 to 3.4 under lockdown, and it decreased slightly to 3.1 in the late pandemic, but still very much above the pre-pandemic levels. So let me here. Okay. Now, in order to in order to compare what's happening, the average work time of these different groups, employed women, employed men, married women, married men, etc., or overall women and men across these different time periods, one of the things that we need to do is adjust for demographic changes, because the April 2018 pre-pandemic survey had, first of all, over 5,000 participants, whereas the pandemic surveys had about 2,500 participants. So there's a big difference in sample size. And then there were also some differences in terms of the distribution of the samples by age or by household income and by regional distribution. So therefore, some of the differences in those average work times can be due to different samplings of the different field surveys rather than the impact of the pandemic. So in zero, what happened with women is that women increased their unpaid work time by 1.23 hours per day from the pre-pandemic to the lockdown. So that's a substantial increase. Multiply that by 7, or, okay, that's also debatable because the survey said, think of a typical weekday in the previous week and please tell me how you spent 24 hours of that typical weekday. So it is possible that people's weekday time use patterns and weekend time use patterns are different. But so these figures show the typical weekdays. So, but 1.23, in order to have an idea about the overall increase, multiply that by 5 days of the week or 7 days of the week to have an idea. Whereas for men, it increased by 0.6 hours. Still in relative terms, it's half of women's, but because men were doing so little to start with, still it is little. With the post-pandemic, the unpaid work time of women decreased, but compare it to the pre-pandemic, it is still higher than the pre-pandemic by 0.69 hours per day. And for men, it is still higher than the pre-pandemic by 0.28 hours per day. Okay, let's look at paid work time. Paid work time decreased if we again take the pre-pandemic level, we set it at 0. The paid work time for women overall, on average, decreased by 0.8 hours per day. For men, it decreased by almost 2 hours per day. And with the normalization, late pandemic, what we see is they go back to exactly to pre-pandemic levels, slightly higher. Okay, and this is showing the impact on total work time, including both paid work time and unpaid work time. So in the on total work time, in the pre-pandemic, men's total work time, paid work time plus unpaid work time, decreased under the lockdown by 1.3 hours. And then with normalization, it is higher than the pre-pandemic at 0.36. Look at women. It's very interesting. Their total work time, even under lockdown, on average, was higher by 0.43. So this difference as to what happened to total work time, how many hours women and men were working on average under lockdown as compared to the pre-pandemic is quite interesting. So one of the things that when we present these results in Turkey, because we had the headlines in the newspapers saying, not only in Turkey, but around the world, I think the economy came to a halt under the pandemic, right? The economy came to a stop. Everything stopped. So then we show these field survey findings and we say, well, we need to ask from a gender perspective and a care economy perspective, whose economy came to a stop? Which kind of economy came to a stop? Okay, so apparently what came to a stop is what decelerated is the men's economy and the market economy. What accelerated, on the contrary, is the unpaid care economy and the paid care economy. Overall, the number of hours of work, both in the paid care sectors and unpaid care work within the household, increased enormously. And women's economy also accelerated. So this is the importance of when we undertake an economic analysis. This is one example that I use in my teachings, that why, if you have a disregard for all the unpaid production that goes, all the household production that goes on in the private sphere, and if you have a disregard for a gender perspective and you hold an economic analysis, you will end up with wrong conclusions, wrong assessments. You will not have a correct assessment. So the pandemic really gives us a good example of this. Okay, so then moving on to the next stage of our analysis, we did an empirical regression analysis, and we put all the data together, 2018, 2020, and 2021, and did a regression looking at the determinants of unpaid work time and paid work time. And then we use the year dummies for 2020 and 2021 to make sure that, you know, that those pandemic years coefficients were confirming our previous results. And then we did a pooled estimation only with the pandemic data, putting together the data from field survey 2020 and 2021. And for this pooled estimation, we looked to see whether remote working, hybrid working, has an impact, statistically significant impact on men's and women's paid and unpaid work time. And then we did a cross-section estimations separately, looking at impact of various demographic factors, household factors, employment status on unpaid work time, whether those demographic impact change from 1 year, from the pre-pandemic to the lockdown to the pandemic. So Marcia reminds me that I have little time left, so I will just emphasize the most important results from this part of the work. So what you see is our overall pooled regression shows a highly statistically significant coefficient, both for year 2020 and 2021, in terms of positive and significant. Look the coefficient, and on the side you see the marginal effects. The marginal effect basically says that women increased their unpaid work time by 1.35 hours under lockdown as compared to the pre-pandemic, and the unpaid work time of women still remains 0.63 hours higher in under normalization as compared to the pre-pandemic. So we were reassured that our previous findings were confirmed. These are here similar findings for men, a 0.5 hour per day increase in under lockdown, and still unpaid work time of men 0.3 hours per day higher as compared to the pre-pandemic. These are the negative coefficients for paid work as compared to, under lockdown as compared to the pre-pandemic, and look at the coefficients for 2021 on paid work for women and men. They are statistically insignificant. So this again shows that the paid work time in 2021 is back to pre-pandemic levels. So it's not a statistically significant impact. And we have similar findings for total work time. This is now coming to the, I think, the more interesting part of the study, looking at the impact of remote employment. Look at this. Remote employment for women increases unpaid work time by 1.5 hours per day as compared to women who are employed at the workplace. This was our base category. We didn't find much of a statistically, there was a positive coefficient on hybrid employment, but not statistically significant. And it also, remote employment decreases women's paid work time. Well, we also included travel time by 0.32 hours per day. Okay. Coming to similar results for men, we find some interesting results here as well. For men, both hybrid work and completely remote work has a positive impact on their unpaid work time. It increases it by 0.34 hours per day in terms of hybrid employment, and almost half hour a day through remote employment. And both types of work also decrease men's paid work and commuting time to different degrees. These are the cross-section results. The cross-section results were a little bit mixed. What we found was that in the pre-pandemic field survey, when we look at the impact of factors such as higher education on unpaid work time, or higher household income, or being in employment, it reduces women's unpaid work time. But with the lockdown survey, we found that in that cross-section, all that impact disappeared. So there was no difference left amongst women in terms of whether they were living in a high-income household, low-income, whether they were university educated, primary school educated, whether they were in employment, not in employment. Their unpaid work time didn't really have much of a difference. With the post-pandemic, late pandemic, we see some of that impact, such as employment, women in employment spending less time on unpaid work, re-emerging once the lockdown conditions have been lifted. Okay, here are preferences for location of paid work that comes from the last survey. Look at this, 42% of women say they are happy to be working remotely and they prefer to continue working remotely. 30% say they prefer some form of hybrid work. For men, 21%, 1/5 say they're happy to be working remotely and prefer to continue like this. 29% say they prefer to work hybrid. So it is not surprising that women's preferences for remote and hybrid work are higher. Adding them up, 72% of women in employment said they prefer either hybrid or remote work, versus almost 50%, well, exactly 50% of men. So what was surprising for us was that there was a very high preference also amongst men for remote or hybrid forms of employment. We weren't expecting it to be. It's basically 1 in 2 men in employment says they'd rather work hybrid or remotely. So it's an interesting indication of how these preferences are shifting. And finally, in the late pandemic survey, we included a series of questions on hypothetical policy interventions, and we asked people whether they would welcome such a policy intervention or not. So, and these entailed provisioning of care services, elder care and child care, or labor market regulations for care leave. Okay, and here are the results. So the attitudes towards elder care services. So we asked 2 questions. Public institutions and municipalities should provide home-based professional care services for the elderly, disabled, or sick people. So the dark blue and the light blue entail positive attitudes, overwhelmingly positive attitudes at over 90%. The second question asks, public institutions and municipalities should provide care services for elderly and disabled through day centers, what we call active living centers in Turkey. There are very few at the moment, but there is a lot of advocacy for them to increase and become basically accessible in all the neighborhoods. Again, over 90% are in favor, both women and men. Similarly, for childcare services, we ask quality nurseries and kindergartens should be provided to all families with children. Almost close to 90%, not so, a little bit lower than elderly care services, so that's interesting, but close to 90%, very positive attitudes. And then this question asks, nurseries and kindergartens should remain open because they were the first ones to close in the Turkish context. Even before the primary schools and secondary schools, universities closed, they first closed kindergartens. So this, whereas in countries such as Sweden, they were the last workplaces to close down. So there was quite a contrast. So this question asks, nurseries and kindergartens should remain open by taking necessary precautions in extraordinary situations such as the pandemic. About 60% of the correspondence says, yes, I agree, I find this right. And 40% said, no, I don't agree, or I'm neutral. It's neither true or false, but we believe this is due to the concerns about contagion of the disease. And finally, the 3 set of questions for leave and care leave and flexible employment conditions for work-life balance. So we said it should be made legal for employed parents to take leave for childcare whenever necessary. 87% in favor. And then we continued the right of employed parents to partially work from home or work flexible hours for childcare when necessary should be legalized. Again, over close to 90% positive support for this. And then we asked a gender question saying facilitating childcare practices of employed parents should include not only mothers, but also fathers. 80% said we are in favor. And when we look at the differences by different, so the above graph shows out of 5 points, the level of positive attitude. So they're all around 4.2, 4.3 for all questions, 3.5 only for childcare centers remaining open under the pandemic. And these are showing the differences between women and men in various questions. They're very similar. So we found overall very high support for men as well. So to conclude, substantially increase in unpaid work time, both for women and men under lockdown, but women ended up absorbing the bulk of the increase in unpaid work time. So the gender gap in unpaid work increased under lockdown. Decline in women's paid work time relatively less than men's. Gender gap in paid work narrowed. Women's total workloads intensified under the lockdown, while men's total workloads were reduced relatively. And this overall workload intensification was dire, particularly for women who continued their employment under lockdown conditions. The increase in men's unpaid work we found was facilitated by working from home and lower employment hours. And we also found under lockdown inequalities in unpaid work time amongst women by education, employment status, and purchasing power decreased. And we sort of, in our lockdown article, we say this is a sign of maybe increasing awareness of care work, not only by men, but also upper socioeconomic privileged groups, and maybe a historical moment for change. With the post-lockdown findings, we find an overwhelming preference, both by women and men, for home-based and hybrid remote work. But we also find that remote work increases unpaid work time for both for women and men, but more for women. So there's an opportunity and a threat simultaneously. So unless we undertake policies to intervene in the labor market to promote flexible work conditions for men and lower regulate full-time employment hours and incentivize men to undertake care work and opt for these flexible work conditions, if we just leave it to its own happenings, people's own preferences, this type of post-pandemic situation context threatens to deepen gender gaps, and overwhelmingly positive attitudes both by women and men towards expansion of care services, care leave, and flexible employment conditions for care. And this provides us with a window of opportunity. And you may wonder whether there are any concrete steps in the Turkish context as a result of all these advocacy efforts. The two main opposition parties, both center-right and center-left, have integrated expansion of care services into their party programs towards the upcoming elections, which will be in June 23. And there has been recently a commission formed in the parliament called the Work-Life Balance Commission, and they are now in the process of gathering information. Okay, so let me stop there, and we can open it up for questions and discussion.
Muchísimas gracias, doctora Ipek. Ahora iniciaremos el diálogo con nuestra audiencia, para lo cual la acompañarán en la moderación tanto la doctora Marcia Leite como la doctora Aureola Quiñones. Así que, pues, les cedo la palabra a ambas por cualquier cosa para que puedan iniciar este diálogo con nuestra audiencia.
Hola, buenos días todavía, casi tardes. Antes que nada, quiero felicitar de nuevo a IPEC. Excelente presentación, un análisis muy detallado, los modelos me encantaron. Y me surge una duda, cuando se va avanzando ese análisis y pensando en la economía mexicana, pensando en las mujeres, incluso la distribución hasta de nuestra ciudad, y si en este análisis en algún momento se consideró incluir el ingreso, porque es diferente el comportamiento que puede ser o la dedicación de horas de trabajo del hogar de acuerdo al nivel socioeconómico de las mujeres.
Well, first of all, I want also to I'm speaking in English.
Okay.
Voy a hablar en español. Disculpa. Hice una confusión con los idiomas. Antes que nada, me gustaría de nuevo agradecer a IPEC por su brillante exposición. Muchas gracias, IPEC. Y parabenizar por esta investigación que fue que profundizó muchas cosas muy importantes para pensarmos en el gap entre el trabajo de las mujeres y el trabajo de los hombres, e incluso cómo podemos trabajar o proponer políticas públicas para disminuir este gap, porque él es de hecho muy grande, ¿no? Y me gustaría traer a la luz algunos resultados de investigaciones que he hecho tanto en Brasil como en México, que han llevado a las mismas conclusiones que la investigación que tú hiciste, ¿no? Bueno, la primera que me llama mucho la atención es el hecho de que las mujeres están mucho más en los servicios esenciales, ¿no? Esto ocurrió tanto en la investigación que hice en Brasil como en la investigación que hicimos Carlos Salas y yo para la ONU aquí en México. O sea, es una cosa que nos sorprende el hecho de que las mujeres están en los trabajos que son esenciales a nuestra sociedad y aún así son remuneradas mucho menos que los hombres, incluso cuando tienen una educación más avanzada, ¿no? Cuando tienen más años de educación que los hombres. Entonces, bueno, hay algo que está, que está un poco complicado, ¿no? En ese arreglo social. La otra es que me llama la atención de tu presentación, es la cuestión del gap en el uso del tiempo entre hombres y mujeres, el gap del trabajo no pagado, ¿no? Que es hecho mucho más entre las mujeres que entre los hombres. Y entonces me hice una pregunta durante tu presentación, porque lo que pasó en nuestra investigación, esto mucho más en Brasil, pero fue muy sorprendente, que las mujeres estaban totalmente en contra del trabajo remoto porque decían, nosotras tenemos que hacer el trabajo en la casa y seguimos teniendo todos los encargos de cuidar de los niños, esto especialmente durante el periodo del lockdown, ¿no? Que los niños no estaban en la escuela. Tenemos que cuidar de los niños y una mujer incluso nos dijo, entonces yo tengo que trabajar el homework en las madrugadas, o sea, cuando ella tenía un niño chiquito de 2 años, cuando mi niño se va a dormir, porque mientras él está despierto, yo no puedo trabajar. Entonces, bueno, ella era casada, vivía con su pareja, con el padre del hijo, entonces encontramos muchas situaciones complicadas como esas, ¿no? Que nos llamaron la atención, ¿no? De el uso del tiempo tan distinto entre hombres y mujeres para el trabajo de care, ¿no? De cuidado. Bueno, es esto. Gracias.
Did you say, Marcia, that you found women were opposed to remote work?
Yes, not all, of course, but some women said that it was horrible for them because they have to
Simultaneously.
Yeah, simultaneously.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Do the both work.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So first, if I go in the reverse order, I have to take this. I think it's a very important point that we need to consider that while remote work or hybrid forms of work enables better reconciliation of workplace responsibilities, employee responsibilities, and family household responsibilities, at the same time, the merging of the locations of these two types of work has serious implications for the stress factor, right? The stress factor also increases. And I think also the location of where you do your paid work, whether you do it in your home or in the office, makes a difference for your unpaid work, because your availability inside the apartment, inside the house, also increases the probability that more will be expected, right? So therefore, it's a double-edged sword, as we put it. You know, there are good sides and bad sides to it. And I think if that's why one of our results is that it is something that needs to be promoted also for men with care responsibilities through policy incentives, workplace incentives, hybrid work and remote work for men, because if it is also promoted for men, then, you know, the double-edged sword thing, you know, is a little bit mediated, because men will also start undertaking some of this work. So if you ask me, I've always believed that the Dutch model of what do they call it? 3/4 times 2 worker model. The 3/4 is, you know, reduced workplace hours by 25%. So if the 3/4 times 2, if both men and the mother and the father of small children reduce the employment hours, or, you know, being in the workplace by 25%, and put those hours towards care in an equal manner, then that seems to be the most human and you know, equal and type of format that enables both women and men to participate in both spheres equally. Yes, but at the same time, the hybrid work also reduces the commute time. So that's an important, that's something that came up in yesterday's also session, that the reducing of commute time is something that's also a green, you know, hybrid and remote work is also a green form of employment in a way, through reducing emissions of transportation. So that's something else that we need to, but the point is making them as gender equal as possible, I think. Coming to I think it's a very good point that you raised about the income. Unfortunately, it's not something that was asked in the surveys. We could have asked it in the 2021 survey because it was a more special survey, but we wanted to stay in the same framework as the previous surveys. So the only, we had one or two variables that could control for potential earnings, potential wages, such as the education level, which was part of the analysis, and the age of the participant and the region of location. So, but those are only weak controls for potential wages. So I think, you know, having wages would have really contributed, if you were to able to observe the wages of employed women and men in the data, it would have contributed to making the analysis more stronger, for sure.
Muchas gracias por tu respuesta, IPEC. Estoy totalmente de acuerdo. Y también iba en sentido de lo que señala Marcia. Justo cuando los niños se cierran las guarderías, hay cierre de actividades, las madres de familia que tenían hijos pequeños, no hay guardería, no hay escuelas, simultáneamente, como lo señalan, están trabajando y cuidando a los niños. Entonces, en ese sentido iba el nivel de ingreso. ¿Quiénes pudieron contratar a alguien que estuviera de planta, como lo decimos nosotros, en casa, haciendo el trabajo de cuidado? Entonces, quienes tenían un mayor ingreso podían hacer este tipo de contrato en el apoyo de horas de cuidado. Entonces, niveles, digamos, directivos tenían este dinero adicional para contratar a alguien. Se da mucho en México que las personas que hacen el trabajo de cuidado en casa, sobre todo en limpieza y cuidado de los niños, van y vienen, y ante la pandemia, el temor al transporte público, pues se cerró el ingreso de estas personas, ¿no? En algunos casos le seguimos pagando, pero hubo personas que despidieron a las personas dedicadas al cuidado. Entonces, en ese sentido iba la importancia del análisis del ingreso, porque las mujeres que no podían sacrificar su ingreso para pagar a una persona que hiciera, o el temor de que ingresara alguien que viene en transporte público al cuidado de sus hijos, el contagio, entonces eso limitaba. Por eso era esta pregunta principalmente, y que como bien dices, pues sí haría, que es muy buen trabajo indudablemente, pero me surgió esta duda porque aquí en México mencionabas también las horas de transporte, ¿no? Del traslado. Aquí en México con la pandemia vivimos esa ventaja, lo estás viviendo, el traslado estos días. Entonces se reducen 2, 3 horas de traslado, de ida a veces son 4, 5, hasta 6 horas de traslado al domicilio de trabajo. En eso hubo ventaja, pero esas 6 horas se dedicaron al lugar, al cuidado de los hijos. Entonces aquí hubo un incremento también muy fuerte en las mujeres al trabajo de cuidado y en esta parte simultánea. Y gracias, excelente tu trabajo. Felicidades.
Hello, I'm so glad to be here. Una pregunta. El día de ayer, en uno de los pilares, hablabas de la corresponsabilidad del cuidado como un principio básico, y lo que vimos en la pandemia, aparte de lo que ya hablaron Marcia, Aureola y tú, acerca de esa intensificación de la doble jornada que viven las mujeres, porque esta doble jornada de trabajo pues no es nueva, quizás se intensificó. Pudo haber existido una oportunidad de visibilizar y vivir por parte de los hombres esta doble jornada de lo que significa el cuidado. En este sentido, conceptualizar, por un lado, el trabajo del cuidado al interior de la vida familiar, cómo se va trastocando cuando las barreras laborales se borran porque el mundo laboral entró a las casas. ¿Existe alguna investigación de tu parte al respecto? ¿Por qué? Porque conceptos propios de la flexibilidad laboral, digamos, de la precarización laboral, se van como, digamos, empalmando en esta idea de dimensionar la vida económica, en una dimensión económica de el cuidado de la vida, el cuidado que se debe de hacer en las familias. Eso es solamente una duda. Yo creo que hay como un traslape, tanto por un lado la precarización del trabajo, porque se están borrando estas fronteras de los espacios del trabajo que entra a la casa. Con la pandemia eso fue muy evidente, pero hay muchas secuelas de la pandemia que siguen presentes, como el trabajo remoto. Nosotros lo vemos en el Zoom, seguimos haciendo clases en Zoom y seguimos los chicos teniendo clases en Zoom, ¿sí? Entonces sigue presente el ámbito familiar donde se desarrolla un trabajo del cuidado de la vida, del cuidado de todas las emociones afectivas que nos pueden retroalimentar para tener una buena reproducción social, pues está totalmente imbricado, traslocado por la vida laboral que ya entró a la casa. Entonces la pregunta es, ¿ha habido en tus investigaciones este tipo de análisis respecto de cómo se van redimensionando, por un lado, estos conceptos de la precarización laboral que entra a los domicilios, y por el otro lado, la concientización de visibilizar el trabajo del cuidado, que es corresponsabilidad de todos los miembros de un entorno familiar, ¿no? Que son dos cosas como diferentes. Esa sería mi pregunta. Muchas gracias, IPEC.
I think the co-responsibility issue came up very clearly in the field surveys, in the field survey findings, where particularly both under the lockdown survey and the late pandemic survey, we find that men who engage in remote employment or hybrid forms of employment, and men who have reduced their employment hours contribute a lot more to household production time as compared to men who continue to work full time at the workplace, in the office or the factory, and who continue to work the same hours of employment. So, for me, of all this research, that is the most important finding, because I take that finding, and this is my interpretation of it. In countries such as Mexico, Turkey, whenever you say, men should contribute more, and one of the recommendations is, for instance, paternity leave. I always meet an opposition saying, oh, in our culture, even if you give men paternity leave, they would go, use it for something else and not to take care of the children. So it is a cultural thing. First, we need to change men's minds, or, like people's thinking. And I always say, no, culture comes secondary. Primary is the material conditions of production and reproduction. And by that material conditions, what I mean is that if you are living in an economy such as Mexico or Turkey, where the statutory work hours are 45, employment shifts are 45 hours a day, de facto employment hours on average are 55 hours a week, including horrible commuting times, then a male worker who works full time does not have any time even to take care of himself. Forget about taking care of a baby, or this is something we talked about yesterday as well. So therefore, by the conditions of your labor market and the requirements of employment being always full-time, at least 45 hours at the workplace, unregulated hours, and so on, you are not providing men with the material conditions upon which they have a choice whether to contribute to household production or not. So for me, primary is you first implement labor market policies, providing men with such as reducing what you mean by a full-time job, how many hours, giving the opportunity, the choice of remote employment, hybrid employment. And then if you're still observing that men's contribution to household work is not increasing, then you take additional measures. But if you just take let's say we hold a huge 1-year campaign, awareness raising campaign in overall Mexico, where, we have role models, actors, president, etc. They come into the kitchen, they cook, they take care of the babies. It's a huge awareness raising campaign to impact people's minds, right? And cultural attitudes. But at the same time, you continue with the same employment hours, the same commuting times, and the same requirements that everybody has to be at the workplace, no matter whether they have a care responsibility or not. So you can change the minds, but if you don't have access to the material conditions, you cannot make that choice. So therefore, primary is the interventions with the labor market policies in that manner, and paternity leave is definitely one of them, and also care leave, both for female and male workers who have elderly or disabled or sick care responsibilities. If somebody in your family becomes seriously ill, like as was the case in so many households with COVID, and somebody who has contracted COVID needs serious care, and somebody needs to care for them. So it should be possible by labor market regulations for the healthy adult in that household to call into the office and say, my wife has contracted COVID, or my daughter or son has contracted, so I need to stay home and work from home today and work less hours because I need some time now to take care of this person by cooking and calling the doctor or whatever. So these kinds of labor market regulations are missing in so many places, and also the field findings are showing us that when you make these material conditions possible, when you reduce employment hours, and when you allow men to work from home, then their contribution to household production, in fact, does increase within the span of 1 month, 2 months. I mean, May 2020, COVID was acknowledged by Turkish officials in March 2020, and lockdown measures started in April 2020. And May 2020, we already are observing men are putting so much more time into household production. So can we say that Turkish men's culture changed in 1 month's time? It wasn't the culture that changed, it was the material conditions of employment that changed. So then it becomes possible, so cultural attitudes then adapt to it. And I think we've seen in social media in my country, so many men posted, films of themselves cooking or, doing household work. Now, we can associate cooking with a male image a lot more than we used to in the pre-pandemic. So the material conditions changed. Men started contributing to household work. They started posting pictures of themselves, therefore, on social media. Then minds started changing.
¿Alguna pregunta a los asistentes? ¿Alguno de ustedes? César, por favor.
Yes. Please, very quick, because I have a lecture now, but congratulate you by your findings. Just a question. I think you give interesting results, but I think could be interesting if you put information about the people who live in countryside and cities. I think the results could be different. Or the studies, or the level of studies of the people, the age. I think you will find different results. But because in Mexico, we have different realities. Depends the countryside and the cities could be find different kind of attitudes in the homes between men and women. So could be a good proposal to do that. But I think it's very important, these results. Congratulations.
Thank you. I think the rural-urban distinction definitely makes a difference in terms of gender distribution of paid and unpaid work. But the samples in here were more urban bias samples, so I should say that. But for age and other demographic factors, we controlled it. And the majority of the population in Turkey is now urban-based rather than rural-based. But there's a return back to the rural, so I think we also need to look at the rural context differently. You're right. Thank you.
¿Alguna pregunta más? Bien, cedo la palabra a Marcia. Clausura. Bueno, el cierre de hoy. Gracias.
Bueno, una vez más, muchas gracias a IPEC por esta discusión tan interesante, y agradezco también a todos y todas que han estado aquí y contribuido a la discusión. Muchas gracias a todos y todas. Perdón. Una cosa más. Los que están registrados, los que están inscriptos, En el taller les vamos a pasar la actividad de hoy en la tarde. Muchas gracias a todos y todas.
Bueno, pues con esto cerramos la segunda jornada del taller de investigación, un análisis económico con perspectiva de género. Y agradecemos a todos y a todas, como mencionaba la doctora Marcia Leite y la doctora Aureola Quiñones, les agradecemos también a ellas dos y por supuesto a la doctora Ipek Ilcarayán, quien estuvo el día de hoy con nosotros, y a su vez también a la organización de la División de Ciencias Sociales y Humanidades de la UAM Coajimalpa, también al Departamento de Economía de la UAM Azcapotzalco, también a la Cátedra Frederick Engels, también al área de Sociedad y Acumulación Capitalista y también, por supuesto, al Cuerpo Académico de Derecho, Administración e Instituciones. A todos ellos, muchísimas gracias por estar en esta segunda jornada del taller de investigación y un análisis económico con perspectiva de género. Esto ha sido Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana, Unidad Coajimalpa, Casa Abierta al Tiempo. Muchísimas gracias. Hasta pronto.
Thank you.
Let's help people in the next couple cycles to avoid these issues.
Are you going there?
I'm going to be there tomorrow.
Okay,
Yes.
okay.
But I'm still listening to some.
Ah, sí, sí, sí.
Sí, exacto.
Pero bueno.
Well, you managed to cover quite a lot. Didn't you? You did manage to cover quite a lot.
Yes, yeah, pretty much everything.
So now it's
I was
called
intending-
Turquía?
Turkey.
Turquía. Sounds
Yeah.
like Spanish. Turquía.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
Turkey. Yeah.
Turquía. But it's
Yeah.
like on an E.
Because in English, the name,
Turkey is like
Turkey.
the animal. It's very
Yeah.
confusing.
and there's a
Sometimes
whole,
when you Google
and
translation.
there's a whole historical story to it behind it.
Turquía sounds very nice.
Yeah. So, but I haven't gotten
Yes,
used to
of
it,
course.
so I should, yeah.
I mean, we're talking about shifting our paradigms
Exactly.
and our patterns.
By the way, tomorrow's presentation. Thank you very much. I couldn't send it to you, to Marcia by email because it says the file is too big. So what I can do is I'm able to share it through Google Drive.
Perfect.
Do you have a Google Drive?
Yeah. Shall I
Okay.
give you my email?
Yeah, I think that would be easier. So because I already.
And then I can send you the article on this. podcast
That would
as
be
well. We can be in
perfect.
communication.
Yes, that would be perfect. I would love that. Here, can we write it here?
Do you have a pen?
Yeah, I did.
Because nowadays,
Thank you.
ahora, with technology, ahora tendrás una pluma. ¿Tú vienes de Lona? Ah, ok.
Here.
Sí.
Sí.
Ah.